The show starts in 3, 2, 1, go.
Good morning, CaneSport. It's September the 30th, 2022. I'm Gary Ferman, the publisher of CaneSport.com, joined today by the great Roy Firestone as we talk about the latest installment of the GOAT series, as well as the news of the day. Presented as always by LifeWallet, where the time is now to take charge of your personal health. And Roy, welcome back to Good Morning CaneSport. Very excited to be bringing a new installment of the GOAT series to the fan base this morning. And but it's an unusual topic. We've had Jim Kelly, we've had Bernie Kosar, we've had Jimmy Johnson, Mario Cristobal, Mark Richt. But today we have a name that a lot of people may not relate to because he's a blast from the past, but this man was probably as significant as so many of the great Miami Hurricanes that come to mind at the tip of the tongue, and that is Chuck Ferman, all-purpose player who had a great career in the National Football League and just was a little bit before his time when it came to Miami Hurricanes greatness, Roy. And talk a little bit about why you wanted to do Chuck Ferman and, of course, what you remember of the great Chuck Ferman, the football player.
Well, you're right, Gary. Thank you for having me again. I don't know how many people watching this right now lived or were alive in the time of Chuck Ferman. It's not like they were wearing leather helmets, but it's a long time ago. It's almost 50 years, almost. He was an unbelievable football player for the Hurricanes and in the National Football League, which we'll get to in a second. Chuck was possibly, in my opinion, the most diversely talented Miami Hurricane football player we ever have. Remember, when he was in high school, this is amazing. He was a defensive tackle, and he played on the other side too. He was a running back. But at the University of Miami, he was a defensive back, he was a running back, and he was a wide receiver and returned kicks. And he also played basketball. He could have played, if Miami, of course, had dropped basketball for 14 years, but Chuck could have been a fine basketball player too. A couple of things that people may have forgotten, Chuck really didn't have a full career as a running back for Miami because he was moved around. In fact, Fran Kersey, who was the head coach, still alive, Fran Kersey, who was the head coach of the Canes in the early 70s, told Chuck at one point, "You're never going to make it as a running back in the National Football League." Well, not only did he make it as a running back in the National Football League, he is a borderline Hall of Famer. And when I say that, talking about Chuck's numbers, from 1974 to 1976 in the National Football League, Chuck Ferman had 51 touchdowns. Now, remember, that's a 14-game schedule. The 14 games really didn't start. It really ended around began around 1960. Before that, there was all shorter seasons. But he had 51 touchdowns. Just to compare it, the same 3-year span, O.J. Simpson had 39. Franco Harris had 36 touchdowns. Jim Brown had 45 touchdowns. This guy was so prolific. He also led the league, the National Football League, in receiving one year. Should have won for total yards and touchdowns. But this is the freakiest story I ever heard. He was on his way and going into the fourth quarter of the game against Buffalo when he played for the Vikings, was hit by a snowball. And it blurred his eyes. And they had to take him out of the game, and he lost the rushing title that year by 6 yards. He would have had 6 yards in the fourth quarter. He was a tremendous football player. The Canes were never a great football team in the years that Chuck played. That's part of the problem. But if you put Chuck Ferman on this team or a Jimmy Johnson team, by the way, Jimmy thinks he's one of the best players he's ever seen, who knows what he would have been like. I think he was typecast as limited, and the opposite was true. He was more talented because he could do more things.
So you did the interview with him, and the latest installment of the GOAT series. And tell us a little bit about that and how you felt, coming coming out of that interview and the conversation that you had with Chuck, which we will be unveiling today?
There's so many fascinating things about this interview. I don't want to spoil it, but if you want to watch a really cool story, he came out of Frederick, Maryland. He could have played for Maryland, but he wanted to play at Miami because he liked the idea of playing in the South. On his way down with his parents in the car, driving to Miami, he was stopped by a highway patrolman who started calling him boy. And Chuck was not a guy who could deal with being called boy very much, and neither could a lot of players these days. And I'm not going to spoil the whole story, but basically he wanted to turn the car around and go home. He never wanted to set foot in the South after that incident. So that was interesting. I wanted to talk to Chuck because obviously he was a classmate of mine, a year older than me, but he was a guy who was such a superstar. Don't forget, we also had players like Reuben Carter, Burgess Owens in that era, talking about that era, and players like Harold Sears, Tony Christiani. They were a talented bunch, but they could never get over the hump. They never won any. It was a whole different alignment than they have now, too. They weren't. I think they were an independent in those days. They played the Notre Dames. They had one of the toughest schedules I could ever recall. They played Alabama and Auburn and LSU and Notre Dame and all of these in a row. So
it was amazing back then.
They played.
I grew up going and watching those games. It was just incredible.
Oklahoma. They had to play Oklahoma when Oklahoma was really the power that they were. So I think that he was unfairly. He's a guy who is. If you put him in a different time, I think there's a shot that he would have been the best back in Miami's history. Again, remember he did not get a full workload as a Cane running back. He was placed in so many. He was returning punts and kicks too.
Yeah.
So I was fascinated by that. Also wanted to know what it was like to play in the days before the NIL, obviously, but also how little money even the National Football League guys got in his era. As I mentioned before, he was coming to the National Football League as a @1 draft pick. And if you think about it, if you put him in today's #1 pick, he'd probably be set for at least a lifetime, maybe a few lifetimes. As a 1973 draft pick, 12th overall in the draft, 12th, he got $50,000 at a base of $26,000. In its day, not bad money, but now they got pocket change like that. It's really amazing. It's an amazing story. Plus, we talked about segregation. You have to understand, folks, for those young people who are watching this, we didn't have a very black team in 1972, 73. I think there were a handful of black players. But he also talked about the courage of a guy named Henry King Stanford, who was the Miami president, the school, University of Miami, who was a Southerner, and it sounded like that. He was a real cracker-sounding fella, but he was an integrationist. He believed that blacks needed to be recruited at Miami. And Chuck talked about him and said, the surprising thing is a Southerner who sounded like every redneck you'd ever imagine, who was the school president, Henry, was his best friend in terms of believing that the school needs to be integrated, the team needs to be integrated. We need more black players, more people of color in the coaching ranks. This is almost 50 years ago. So he was way ahead of his time. And it was just fascinating to talk to Chuck. Also, we talked about money and, what happens to a player who's making pretty good money and how many hands come out. We're going to talk to Leon Searcy about that, I think, in the next few weeks. You see that Warren Sapp had something like $80 million. He ended up with $800 to his name. There's, Mike Tyson had $400 million, ended up broke. I think it was something like 60 or 70% of all NFL players 5 years out of the league are broke. Incredible.
Well, these guys make such bad decisions.
Yes.
I mean, I'm watching the Miami Heat now, and there's a young kid on the team, Tyler Hero, who's not even 21 years old. He had some girlfriend. He's on his second kid. Okay, like I'm thinking, what are these guys thinking? Like what? How are they processing these things? And
true. Well, I mentioned Sapp. He had $82 million in football, ended up with $800 in his name. But it's not just limited to African-American kids or minority kids. Johnny Unitas,
Yeah.
he went $3.2 million in the hole after that incredible career he had. Travis Henry, 9 children, 9 women, broke. Vin Baker, remember basketball's Vin Baker, lost $100 million. As I mentioned before, Mike Tyson, $400 million. I think, and Chuck talks about this, we need to see some sort of structuring, not just the NIL for these players, but counseling. I know Miami has some
education, right? Counseling, education. Don't don't ruin your life. You have so much going for yourself. I mean,
I want to say that Vilma is one of the guest instructors, whatever you want to call it, to talk about money management. They had Jonathan Vilma come in.
I believe he does, yeah, on campus.
Yeah. Other players who've done it too. But what's really being talked about now is that because of the NIL, you're seeing some of these kids with several $100,000. Again, you're 18, 19, 20 years old, and you got $800,000. You're going to burn through it pretty fast unless you're really wise. And by the way, while we're on the subject, and I just finished Leon Searcy's book, I'm not trying to denigrate Drew Rosenhaus, but when the money is gone, Drew Rosenhaus was nowhere to be found for Leon Searcy. He was his agent, by the way. So sometimes it's not the agent who is going to be the savior. These people have to find some way. I think who was I talking to? It may have been Mark Richt, who said they should put money in a trust fund for these players.
I agree.
They lock it away. I don't know if it's legal. I don't know if you can do that. You can take they have to agree to do it. But if you can put it in a trust fund, it also can accrue value over a course of a period of time. And then when they graduate or when they leave the school, some people believe that if you transfer, you go into a portal, you lose the money. I don't know if that would work, but there are people who believe that too. But anyway, getting back to Chuck, he said, I never had a ton of money, but I had a lot of pretty good money for my time. And it was all gone. He tried a trucking business. He tried a lot of things. He's a substitute teacher now, among other things. Great guy, very candid interview. I think people are going to really enjoy this. An incredible athlete. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Chuck because I was 8 years old at the time when he started playing for Miami, and that was when I had my introduction to the Miami Hurricanes, and I started going to the Orange Bowl to games. And I remember it very vividly watching Chuck Ferman throughout his entire career just do amazing things on the football field, never appreciating back then how great he really was because I was a little kid. But now, obviously, looking back, and of course, I watched his whole NFL career. So I think it's nice that we were able to bring sort of a blast from the past into this GOATs series.
Well, that's the whole point of this, Gary. This is GOATs. These are the greatest of all time, not just an era that we all know.
Right.
I mean, it'd be great to have, these players that I just mentioned that played in the last 10, 15 years. But the guys who built the program from the beginning, and by the way, they thought about dropping Miami football, as you know, right in the early 70s, because the crowds were so poor. But these guys, Chuck Ferman and Burgess Owens were back-to-back #1 draft picks. I don't know how many times that's happened in Miami history, but not a lot, I don't think. Back-to-back in the first round. So they were both great players. They both had great careers. And Chuck talks about the early years. And, let's face it, the era of civil rights. There's a player named Ray Bellamy that a lot of Cane fans, unless you're of a certain age, have no idea who that is. That's the first African-American player Miami ever had. And we're talking in the late 60s.
I know.
Can you imagine only one black player on the team? And he was a fine receiver. He got hurt in an automobile accident. It was never the same. But Chuck talked about all the pioneers. I mean, again, it's not like we're talking about them wearing leather helmets here.
Right. No, they were real helmets.
It's not that long, terribly that long ago.
Yeah.
And if you're a person of a certain age, like your age, my age, boy, you can only admire Chuck Ferman. And he was very outspoken, very opinionated, told some great stories. I urge people to watch it. They'll enjoy it.
Yeah. All right, Roy, I know you're busy but before we let you go, you've watched the Miami Hurricanes so far this year. I think you've seen pretty much every game.
Yeah.
What have your thoughts been so far this season?
Well, there's a mixed bag. I really was excited to start the season, but like a lot of fans, I think I expected maybe a little too much first go. And I knew we were a little thin at wide receiver. I knew that was going to be a problem. What we lost was Restrepo. Obviously, that really hurt. And then, of course, we lost a couple of other players since. I'm disappointed, but I'm not believing that this could be a disastrous season. I mean, if they had more injuries, it might. But I think they're still deep enough at quarterback, obviously, which we'll talk about in a second, at running back. I just don't know. You know, a lot of people are down on Gaddis as their offensive coordinator, but you can only win with players who are elite. And right now, the receivers are, in my opinion, and probably yours too, are not elite. They're not getting open. I think it's caused a lack of confidence on the part of TVD, and maybe less so with Van Dyke because he hasn't had many snaps. But if you can't throw the ball downfield with confidence, I mean, last year you had Rambo and Harley. Those were the two primary receivers. I mean, Rambo was open all the time.
Yeah,
and
Rambo was open all the time.
Unbelievable catches too,
Yes.
one-handed and in the end zone. And Harley was doing it. And then you add some other players who really helped, and they had a full complement of receivers. I don't think it's just the receivers, though. There's other problems.
You're down to your fifth running back.
Yep. What's that?
You're down to your fifth running back essentially last week.
Right. Well, Parrish, I believe, is going to be back.
Played a little. Knighton played a little, but they were banged up. I think
Knighton. I don't know what's going on with Knighton. It may be injuries, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm more worried about the receivers than the running back. But as I said, there's been breakdowns in the defensive secondary a lot. We saw Ivy get burned terribly. We saw more long bombs completed against Miami, 3, than I can recall in any game in the last several years. I've never seen so many deep burns. And I think there's been a lack of effort, frankly, in some circles. I'm not going to necessarily single anybody out because I'm not really looking at all the film, but I think there's some horrible tackling again, like we had last year with Manny. With Manny's teams were bad tackling teams. We're seeing that happening again. The bottom line is, though, Gary, this is not going to be an overnight fix anyway. I didn't think they were going to win the national title this year, but my concern is if they could lose any game. In my opinion now, any game, because they're so thin until maybe Restrepo comes back. But in my opinion, I think it could hurt recruiting. I think if you see Miami,
it already is, yeah.
If they go through a tailspin, these kids they want to be on a winning team. And Mario's a great recruiter, but hey, man, if you're trying to sell your team and they've won 5 games for the season, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it who knows? Maybe it could. And you're trying to sell a team. These kids they want to play for national championship quality teams. So I'm worried about that too.
No, there's time though till December. There's time to get on new kids. There's time to get back on old kids. You know, there's time. And NIL is going to have a lot to
I hope they bounce back, and I think they will. I don't know that they're going to run the table or anything. I think that they're looking at some tough. FSU's a tough game. Obviously, Clemson's a tough game. I think Carolina suddenly looks a little more imposing than they did 3 weeks ago when they were giving up 66 to Appalachian State.
Yeah,
they scored 35 points against a pretty good Notre Dame defense, by the way, coached by Al Golden.
Yep.
I think any game is a toss-up now.
No doubt.
It's hard to say. I'm such a Kane guy. It killed me to watch this past week. I'm
trying not to overreact to it because I felt pretty good about the team coming out of the Texas A&M game. I felt like they were physical and that it was going to bode well in the Coastal. And then last Saturday happened, and you don't know what to think.
But you rightly said, and this is a good point. What do you call it? Middle Tennessee. They were not untalented. They had some speed, and they had some talent on the skilled positions. So they were once they got. I think that the problem is, and I'm just going to go back real briefly to that game. Okay, you got an interception in the first possession of the game, then you get a tip, and you're down 10-0, and all of a sudden, the place is unhappy and understandable. And I think TVD got deer in the headlights. I really do. I think he got.
You get your first 2 balls intercepted. That'll rattle anybody.
Yeah, I think he wasn't the same player. I'm hoping they give him some short tosses. He's got to start to go downfield. We saw Garcia go downfield, but you got to have the skilled players. If you don't, it's going to be tough. They're not getting separation. But all of that being said, I still think they have talent. I still think that they're going to get some players back. Hopefully, Restrepo will be back for the Florida State game, maybe the Clemson game. I'm not sure, but they're going to need to get these players back, and boy, they're going to need to recruit some speed. They don't seem to have a lot of speed, and I worry about that too. Parrish has been a pleasant surprise. I don't know what's going to happen with the Rooster, if he's going to be banged up all season, but they need some weapons, and they don't seem to have it offensively.
All right, Roy. Well, we're really looking forward to Chuck Foreman today, and I hope everybody really enjoys it. And thank you so much for the latest installment of the series and for being part of this this year.
I'm having a great time with it. And just for those who've never heard of Chuck Foreman, I urge you to watch the show. He was such a great football player, maybe the most gifted all-around athlete we've ever had at Miami football. He was that talented. So I think they'll enjoy it, and they'll enjoy his story too.
All right, Roy, we'll check in with you soon.
So you got it, Gary. Thank you again.
Growing up in Australia was unreal. I grew up in a small fishing town where I kind of had the freedom to go running around, go fishing and all that stuff. From there, I moved to the city where I didn't really have as much freedom to run around, so I got really heavily involved into sports, and that kind of progressed on towards playing at a semi-professional level here in Australia, and then moving forward to playing college level football in America currently. I think maybe my biggest inspiration is kind of looking back at the life I had, just working construction for 8 years, and sometimes I sit back and kind of have to realise how far I've come since putting on the high vis and throwing a hammer around, looking back and seeing how far I've come from then. Going to uni, getting a degree, onto my masters, playing football at an elite level. I think just going back and seeing how far I've come, it made me realise that I can keep going, play at a professional level because I've already come this far. Looking back and seeing how proud everyone is here, back in my hometown, and just that keeps motivating me.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about the other news of the day on the website. Yesterday, we took a deep dive into the Canes offense with the help of Pro Football Focus grades through the first 4 games. Today, we jump over to the defensive side of the ball and take a deep dive into the Canes defense to bring you insight into what exactly you're seeing, what players are standing out, at least from the external lens of the evaluators at Pro Football Focus. So I hope you guys enjoy that. And I want to see comments on the message boards too, because there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out in both the offense story from yesterday and the defense story from today that should provide discussion here over the weekend with an off weekend with no game. So, take your comments, take your thoughts to the message boards, and we'll chop it up there over the weekend. We also have a recruiting update on local standout Edwin Joseph. The Hurricanes are making him a big priority. He's a kid from Hollywood Chaminade, was not highly recruited early, erroneously, I might add, because he's an incredible prospect and is just indicative of what happens every year in South Florida, where guys kind of fly in from off the radar. They develop physically, from earlier in their career, become better players, and then in their final year are standouts ready to be signed by the major colleges around the country. And Edwin Joseph's offer list is expanding. Still feel the Hurricanes are in a decent place there, but we'll take you inside his recruitment and give you an update on Edwin Joseph. And from yesterday afternoon, we also catch up with another emerging young man from Miami Northwestern by the name of Jamari Ford. He's a little bit of a smallish receiver, skill athlete, but excels on kick returns and doesn't have a Miami offer yet, but they were checking him out yesterday on campus. He visited and talked with the coaches, including Mario Cristobal. So we update you on that recruitment as well. And we will stay focused on recruiting primarily through the weekend and bring you many more updates on what the coaches are up to here with this open week to prepare for North Carolina. And I'm sure we'll have some more quarterback talk somewhere along the way as well. So that's going to do it for this morning for Good Morning CaneSport. Thank you so much for starting your day with us. I want to thank Roy Firestone for coming and spending a few minutes. Make sure you check out that Goats latest installment on Chuck Ferman. You're not going to feel as familiar with it as you might have felt with the other ones, to be honest. But I hope you guys enjoy getting a glimpse into somebody that was kind of like a pace setter from Miami. And go on YouTube and search Chuck Ferman highlights and take a look at what a phenomenal football player the great Chuck Ferman was. I think you will appreciate him and probably appreciate this Goats installment a little bit more. If you've missed any of the Goats series to this point, in today's content item, we link all the past episodes as well with Jimmy and Bernie and Mark Richt and Jim Kelly. So make sure that you catch up on that this weekend as well with a little more time on your hands. They've all been really great. So have a great day. Have a great weekend, everybody. And we'll see you back again on this show on Monday.